History of Persia is a Hopful Media podcast production.
BetMGM has an unreal deal for sports fans in Iowa. Turn $5 into $150 instantly when you place your first wager at BetMGM. Simply download the BetMGM app and sign up using code Hawkeye150. Then, place a $5 wager on any sport. You'll receive $150 in bonus bets, regardless of your wager's outcome. And if you think the fun stops there, the king of sportsbooks has plenty of surprises in store. Check out daily promotions, same-game parlays, live bets, and so much more. No matter your team or your sport, BetMGM is for you. Download the app in Iowa today and get $150 in bonus bets instantly from your first wager. Only at BetMGM. BetMGM and GameSense remind you to play responsibly. See BetMGM.com for terms. 21 plus only. Iowa only. New customer offer. Subject to eligibility requirements. Rewards are non-withdrawable bonus bets that expire in 7 days. Please gamble responsibly. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-BETS-OFF.
What's so special about Hero Bread's soft, fluffy, and delicious breads, buns, and tortillas? These ultra-low net-carb baked goods contain zero sugar, fewer calories, and more protein than the leading brands, and are high in fiber to support gut health. Shop now at hero.co.
Hello everyone, welcome to the History of Persia. I'm Trevor Cully, and this is episode 122, Alexander in Love. I am once again asking you to send your questions for the episode 125 AMA. You can ask me anything about me, podcasting, history, etc., but I really want your questions about Alexander and the Achaemenids as this phase of history is coming to a close. Message me on social media, historyofpersiapodcast.com, hopfulmedia.com, or email historyofpersiapodcast@gmail.com. Anyway, last time, we talked about Alexander the Great's plans in 323 BCE for another campaign of conquest. Curtius claimed that he would target Carthage. Diodorus said Carthage and Sicily. Livy said he would conquer Rome, too. I explained why none of those targets actually made much sense, and how Arrian's explanation of a planned invasion of eastern Arabia is the most likely option. Then I left off on the cliffhanger that, regardless of the truth, Alexander's plans for continued expansion would never see the light of day. However, I will not be continuing that story today. Instead, I want to talk about King Alexander's family life, both because it is infamous and chaotic, and because I just like to try and do an episode on the families of the kings who live long enough to have one. Given that we're in the only real break in the narrative action that I can find, this is as good a place as any. So, let's rewind all the way back to Alexander's adolescence in his father's Macedonian court. Obviously, there is the father himself, King Philip II. However, I dedicated the entirety of episode 105 to Philip and his reign, so I don't really think we need to dwell on him in this episode. Instead, we will start with Alexander's mother, the enigmatic and powerful Olympias of Molossia. Olympias probably was not her original name. In fact, we don't even know exactly what that would have been. She was married to Philip in order to form an alliance between her father, King Oribas of Molossia, and Philip in 358 BCE. She then took the name Olympias to honor her husband's Olympic victory in 356 while she was pregnant with Alexander. Olympias was noted in many ancient sources for her jealousy and personal desire for power, beyond just being Philip's wife. often leading to estrangement between Olympias and the king. In episode 105, there were several incidents in Alexander's youth where Olympias pushed hard to get her son more power and ensure that Alexander, rather than one of Philip's other sons, would inherit the throne. On one hand, she did succeed. On the other, most ancient accounts also doubt that Philip ever really considered somebody else for the job, so Olympias was running unnecessary interference against her husband's own kingdom. The queen constantly reinforced to her son that he was the descendant of two mythical heroes: Heracles, supposed ancestor of the Agiad kings in Macedon, and Achilles, supposedly one of Olympias's own ancestors. She insisted that this would give Alexander the foundation to do great things. Olympias's son obviously took this to heart, maybe a little too much, by retroactively declaring that Olympias had actually slept with the god Zeus rather than Philip to conceive Alexander. That said, she endorsed that story. Still, Olympias stayed behind in Macedon while Alexander conquered the Persian Empire. They exchanged letters regularly, but Alex made a point to keep her at arm's length from actual political power. That did not stop his mother from trying to direct domestic affairs herself, especially while Antipater, the official regent, was off in the south defeating the Spartan uprising, so this caused no shortage of strain between the regent and the queen, with both asking Alexander to intercede on their behalf, and Alexander mostly leaving them to bicker about Macedonian affairs themselves until 330, when Olympias left Macedon to rule directly in their vassal kingdom of Epirus. Acting as regent for her young cousin after her brother, the Epirote king, died while campaigning in southern Italy as part of an alliance with a Greek city-state called Taras. All of this, of course, with her son's consent, but Alex mostly seems to have been relieved that his mother and regent would stop fighting one another. Olympias has a reputation for being conniving and scheming. This often plays into her background as a semi-barbarian royal from the far north of the Greek world, who participated in mystery cults and worshipped a strange goddess associated with snakes. This goddess was very likely a local variant of Aphrodite and/or Ishtar, somewhere on the Ishtar continuum of goddesses that comes up every now and then on this show. Snakes were a routine part of the iconography in that particular strain of ancient religion. However, aside from being one of a dozen candidates for ordering Philip's assassination, most of Olympias's reputation was earned later in life. This is normally the part of the episode where I do a brief run-through of the king's aunts, uncles, and cousins, and I will do some of that, but Alexander's extended family is absolutely massive. Part of this is surely just the result of better documentation for the Macedonian royals at this time than most points in the Achaemenid family's history. However, it's also a bit different from Achaemenid history, in that those extended family members are usually relevant to the main narrative later on, and those relationships provide context for their actions. That's just not the case here. Most of Alexander's stepmothers, aunts, uncles, and cousins either drop off the map when Alexander comes to power, and most histories leave Macedonian affairs behind, or they remain relevant in Macedon but not in the history of Persia. For instance, it's not even clear whether or not Philip II's first wife, and thus one of several stepmothers to Alexander, Audata, was even alive by the time Alexander came to power. But her daughter is at least interesting. Cunane, daughter of Aldata and Philip, and half-sister to Alexander the Great, was initially married to Amyntas IV, Alexander's cousin, who was deposed by Philip as an infant and allowed to grow up under Philip's care, until Alexander came to power, at which point Amyntas was executed as a threat to Alexandrian authority. Cunane would not remarry, but she would seek out other unconventional avenues to power. She became a military commander in Macedon with her own regiment of soldiers on the home front, and not in a performative capacity or just as a strategic coordinator. Cunane trained to fight with her men from the front every bit as much as her more famous half-brother, even as she raised Eurydice, her sole child by the late Amyntas IV. Just log Cunane and Eurydice in the backs of your minds for the time being. Alexander the Great did have one full sister as well, and I apologize for the names, but get used to it. This sister was Cleopatra. She was married to Alexander the First of Epirus. She briefly assumed power after her husband died in Italy in 334, until Olympias arrived to rule as regent, while Cleopatra took over the duties of a sort of high priestess in Molossia. We don't know much about her time in power over Epirus, aside from an inscription from Cyrene in Libya, referencing that she ordered a massive shipment of grain and sold the rest off to Corinth. Plutarch also references how Alexander the Great sent her a letter joking about how Cleopatra was getting the most out of her position while her husband was in Italy by having an affair with a handsome younger man. Also, the boy Olympias and Cleopatra were ruling in place of was a distant cousin named Iacides, who obviously was just a child at this point, but will do a little bit later on. Two of Philip II's other wives, Phila and Meda, are historical non-entities, largely recorded as just names in the list. Nicesipolis, Philip's third wife before Olympias, is basically the same, but Nicesipolis' daughter, Thessaloniki, is at least a bit interesting. I don't quite know why Nicesipolis has the word for city in her name, but she was Thessalian, so naming her daughter Victory of Thessaly sort of makes sense. The city of the same name does not exist at this point in history, or more accurately, it's going by a different name, but it was eventually renamed in her honor. Thessalonike was much younger than her famed brother, just 6 or 7 years old when Alexander set out to invade the Persian Empire. Alexander notably did not arrange a marriage for her at any point, or direct Olympias and Antipater to do so, possibly in an attempt to limit the number of people who could claim descent from Philip II. According to legends about Alexander the Great that sprung up over the centuries, Thessalonike did not die, but actually became a mermaid after her brother's death because Alexander had used her hair to concoct a potion of immortality. I will cover that in a bonus episode at some point because the Alexander romance is wild. Another of Philip's wives, Philina, is even more of a historical footnote than Nicesipolis, though Philina's son, Aridaeus, is more important. Aridaeus was actually older than Alexander, but he had some kind of psychological disability. It wasn't extreme in any way. Arrhidaeus was able to participate in Macedonian high society, but it was enough that his father decided that Arrhidaeus wasn't fit to succeed the throne, giving that role to Alexander instead. When Philip II tried to arrange a marriage pact between Arrhidaeus and the satrap king Pixodaris of Caria, Alexander the Great intervened to make sure that Arrhidaeus wouldn't marry and have a child before Alexander himself could secure power. So again, whatever disability Arrhidaeus struggled with, Alexander and Philip didn't think it would disrupt his ability to marry and reproduce. It also doesn't seem to have disrupted Arrhidaeus' ability to serve as a military officer of some sort. We don't actually know where Alexander's most prominent half-sibling was for most of the Persian conquest, but at this point, by the time Alexander was planning his next campaign, Arrhidaeus had been summoned to join his brother in Babylon. Philip's final wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, not to be confused with Cleopatra or Eurydice, featured prominently in episode 105 because that marriage sparked Olympias' concern that Philip would disenfranchise Alexander. Of course, that did not happen, but it also didn't stop Olympias from arranging Cleopatra Eurydice's assassination, along with her young son and infant daughter when Alexander took the throne. That brings us to Alexander's romantic partners and possible partners, which we will get into right after a quick break.
BetMGM has an unreal deal for sports fans in Iowa. Turn $5 into $150 instantly when you place your first wager at BetMGM. Simply download the BetMGM app and sign up using code Hawkeye150. Then, place a $5 wager on any sport. You'll receive $150 in bonus bets, regardless of your wager's outcome. And if you think the fun stops there, the king of sportsbooks has plenty of surprises in store. Check out daily promotions, same-game parlays, live bets, and so much more. No matter your team or your sport, BetMGM is for you. Download the app in Iowa today and get $150 in bonus bets instantly from your first wager. Only at BetMGM. BetMGM and GameSense remind you to play responsibly. See BetMGM.com for terms. 21 plus only. Iowa only. New customer offer. Subject to eligibility requirements. Rewards are non-withdrawable bonus bets that expire in 7 days. Please gamble responsibly. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-BETS-OFF.
As I've noted several times, Alexander's first wife was Roxane, daughter of the Sogdian warlord Oxyartes, and really, we've already mentioned just about everything there is to say on the subject of Roxane at this point. So just to recap, the Lord of all Asia first encountered his future bride when the Macedonian army captured the fortress known only as the Sogdian Rock. There, Roxane and her sisters were hiding out while their father rebelled against the king. When his daughters fell into Macedonian hands, Oxyartes promptly surrendered, only to be surprised when Alexander proposed a marriage alliance in the form of said Roxane. This is usually portrayed as astonishing to everyone except Alexander himself. There was little perceived value or legitimacy to be gained in a marriage pact to the middling Sogdian nobility. The only explanations are that Alexander genuinely either found Roxane so physically attractive that he had to have her, or so intriguing that he wanted to spend all of his time with her. Or Sogdian resistance was significantly more formidable than any of the sources would actually have us believe, and this marriage pact was necessary for settling the conquest of that region. Regardless of the truth, Roxane and Alexander were promptly married after the Sogdian revolt was fully defeated. The new imperial queen and her father went on to travel with the army all through the Indian campaign and the crossing of the Gedrosian desert. But she and Alexander did not successfully conceive a child until early 323 BCE, meaning that she was pregnant while Alexander prepared to invade Arabia. A few months before Roxane became pregnant, Alexander was also married to 2 more women as part of the massive wedding ceremony at Susa, this time to the expected candidates from the Achaemenid dynasty, sealing his legitimacy as ruler of the former Persian Empire. First, he married Stateira the Younger, daughter of his rival Darius III. Stateira had been in a sort of limbo for years, first as a hostage after being captured with most of her family following the Battle of Issus, then waiting around Ecbatana and Susa while Alexander conquered the Eastern Empire. The king had always treated Stateira cordially, but he had never expressed much interest in her as a marriage prospect prior to their wedding, when the political and social pressure of consolidating his rule finally forced him to make that match official. Alexander also married Parysatis II, ironically making him husband to both a Stateira and a Parysatis, setting up the ultimate potential harem politics rematch in Persian history. We really don't know much about Parysatis except that she was a daughter of Artaxerxes III, and that her marriage to Alexander would have secured his place as heir to that side of the Achaemenid family as well. Given the dubious nature of Darius III's succession in the first place, and the fact that Stateira was born before her father became king, this would have been an especially important political union with Parysatis II, securing both the porphyrogeniture and primogeniture camps in Achaemenid succession politics through both of Alexander's new wives. However, that is probably not the full extent of Alexander's sexual liaisons. Of course, Alexander spent the first 29 years of his life unmarried, a relatively long time for a crown prince turned warrior king, especially with his father's vast harem as a precedent. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that Alexander was totally inexperienced before he met Roxane. There are 3 women that feature in stories of Alexandrian premarital sex. Plutarch and the Roman romantic biographer Aelian both claim that Alexander had brief affairs, or at least encounters, with women when he was still a prince. Plutarch just briefly references that Alexander slept with a musician, probably an enslaved woman from the household of another Macedonian noble. Aelian claims that Prince Alexander carried on a brief affair with an older noblewoman named Campaspe from the city of Larissa, who initiated their short relationship. Then we have Barsine, daughter of satrap Artabazos II of Hellespontine Phrygia, and later of Bactria, during his exile in the Macedonian court. Philip II initially tried to arrange a marriage between Barsine and Alexander before her family returned to the Persian Empire, and she married her uncle, Mentor of Rhodes, who eventually went on to be a naval thorn in Alexander's side during the conquest of Anatolia. Like Parysatis and Stateira, Barsine was captured after the Battle of Issus. However, unlike all of the other Persian noblewomen captured in that raid, there was a persistent rumor in antiquity that Alexander went on to have sex with Barsine while he campaigned through the Levant. The sources don't really comment on whether or not that would have been a consensual, relighting an old flame sort of relationship or not. claiming Barcine as a spoil of war, so to speak. However, most modern historians doubt that it happened at all, and the whole affair is likely a rumor propagated by Barcine herself in later years. I mentioned this in the last episode, but Barcine supposedly already had a son named Heracles, living in the Anatolian city of Pergamon when she was married to Nearchus at Susa. She would later claim that Heracles was the illegitimate son of Alexander. However, this son was also about 16 years old at the time, meaning that he would have been born 4 years before Alexander set foot in Asia, let alone captured Barcine. The stories and theories of the Lord of all Asia's sexuality are also not limited to women. Alexander is occasionally portrayed as having a relationship with the young Persian eunuch Bagoas, who had been a court functionary under Darius III and fell into Alexander's orbit once the Macedonians seized Babylon. In some interpretations, Bagoas was also a lover of Darius before meeting Alexander. However, as intriguing as some of the fictional stories written about Bagoas can be, including his portrayal in Oliver Stone's Alexander, there's not really much information out there about the eunuch. He supposedly interceded with Alexander on behalf of Nabarzanes, the chief Persian cavalry commander captured by the Macedonians at the Caspian Gate. But more importantly, Curtius describes Bagoas as Alexander's Eromenos, the younger partner in a Greek pederastic relationship. Most descriptions of Bagoas would plant him in his mid-teens at the time he met Alexander, and Curtius's use of Eromenos is the most explicit indication of Alexander having a sexual relationship with another masculine person in any of our main sources. It should be noted that Bagoas does not appear at all in most of the major sources on Alexander's life. If you believe Curtius, there was no doubt about the tenor of their relationship, though. Most famously, Bagoas had endeared himself to the Macedonian soldiers while traveling with the army all the way from Babylon to Bactria to India, and he performed in a dancing competition to lift everyone's spirits while crossing the Gedrosian desert. According to Plutarch, Alexander declared Bagoas the victor, and came down from his throne to the assembled soldiers chanting, kiss him, before kissing Bagoas as a reward. Finally, there's the controversial subject of the moment. Thanks, Netflix. I promise to review that particular bit of schlock as soon as it's no longer relevant, and I can find it in me to start caring about it. So let's talk about Hephaestion. Of course, he died in the last episode, but no accounting of Alexander's personal relationships could be complete without him. I've mentioned several times before how there is a common and popular theory that Alexander and Hephaestion were lovers. One thing is beyond doubt. Hephaestion was Alexander's closest personal friend. They were educated together by Aristotle in Macedon, alongside many of the most prominent noble youths in the kingdom. But Hephaestion, above all others, became Alexander's personal confidant. He was head of the king's personal bodyguard, a major commander in his own right. He was the person accompanying Alexander when he met the Persian royal women, and at Alexander's side through every major event, war council, and trial they faced in their many conquests. He was named Chiliarch, second in command of the whole empire, after returning from Gedrosia. When Hephaestion encouraged changes in policy, Alexander listened, a stark contrast to the many nobles who found themselves executed or just outright murdered for questioning the king. He was one of the first nobles to voice support for Alexander's marriage to Roxane, and Alexander had Hephaestion marry Drupetis, younger daughter of Darius III, specifically so that Alexander would have a legal family connection as an uncle to their future children, even though that never came to pass. Alexander's grief at Hephaestion's death, described in episode 120, should demonstrate their uniquely close bond clearly enough on its own. But were they lovers? I want to start by addressing the two least controversial points. Hephaestion was given the title/epithet Philalexandros by Alexander himself. This literally means lover of Alexander. As much as I'd like for that to be case closed, the ancient Greek word philos, meaning lover, is a bit more complicated than just that. It was used by some ancient writers to describe homosexual relationships. However, it was also a pretty common way to describe an obsession, dedication, or simple interest in a particular subject. The most common version of this was Hellenophile, meaning lover of Greece or lover of the Greeks, used to describe foreigners with an interest in Greek culture. We still do this today with all sorts of words for that very reason. For instance, I'm currently summoning all of my self-control and dignity not to make a joke about what a lover of podcasts would be. Which version was meant by Hephaestion Philalexandros? We don't know. It could have been both. The other uncontroversial point is that both the sources and Alexander as described by them routinely compare Alexander and Hephaestion to Achilles and Patroclus in the Greek epic the Iliad. You'll find very few scholars, either historians or Homericists today, who deny the sexual element of Achilles and Patroclus' relationship in the Greek epic cycle. Basically none who aren't blatantly homophobic in general. Admittedly, this isn't made obvious in the Iliad, as we know it today. But the Iliad was just one part of a larger tradition in antiquity, and this was the very common interpretation back then, when people knew all of the stories as a baseline of popular culture. Was Alexander invoking that aspect of Achilles and Patroclus in his comparisons to Hephaestion? I think so, but it is not clear-cut. On to the more heavily debated aspect of things, there are several more explicit references to Alexander and Hephaestion in ancient literature, such as Lucian of Samosata, a contemporary of Arrian living in Roman Syria, who describes how Hephaestion spent all night in Alexander's tent, or a papyrus fragment of unclear origin that suggests that Alexander would yield to no opponent except for Hephaestion's thighs. However, Lucian was a satirist, known for a comedic writing style, and most similar references are just that. References in larger works on mostly unrelated topics from less historical-oriented sources. It very clearly shows that ancient people thought Alexander and Hephaestion might have had a sexual relationship as well. This is not a modern theory. That said, anybody arguing against their relationship on the basis that those sources are very late is, at best, horribly uninformed and should not be taken seriously. As I have pointed out repeatedly, all of the sources for Alexander come from centuries after his death. That doesn't mean anything one way or the other. On one hand, there was much less stigma about homosexuality in ancient Greece and West Asia than in the modern Christianized or Islamicized world. On the other hand, there were still sexual politics and social conventions at the time. For instance, being the receiving partner was seen as somewhat shameful, a role fit only for servants and prostitutes. Both of the men in question here were powerful nobles, so neither Alexander nor Hephaestion could really have bragged about that without one of them being taken less seriously. That said, that stigma about being a bottom or a top was developed more in Rome than in Greece. Then again, who in their right mind would have mocked Alexander the Great and his best friend in a context where either of them might find out about it? Alexander murdered men in cold blood for less. So what's the conclusion here? Personally, I think Alexander and Hephaestion were probably romantically and sexually involved with one another. It was a widespread enough idea in antiquity when all of the primary sources were still in circulation, and the reasons for downplaying it in the major sources are pretty obvious. Most of our sources today come from the Roman period, when there was a greater level of shame in the ambiguity of their relationship. It is entirely possible that the actual primary sources had more specific details and people didn't like that part, so they were left out of these later summaries. That is certainly the implication in the Yield to Hephaestion's Thighs papyrus. That said, the evidence is ultimately inconclusive. We can't actually say for sure that these two were more than extremely close friends. I do think it does a disservice to both history and popular understanding of relationships, especially male relationships, to frame all such close friendships as sexual. Alexander and Hephaestion do remain in the realm of speculation, but again, very well-supported speculation. And if you follow the story of Alexander and Bagoas, their relationship is made perfectly explicit by Quintus Curtius. Unfortunately, without children of his own at this point, that brings the discussion of Alexander's family to a close. Join me next time for a brief return to the narrative as our story reaches a fever pitch. Until then, if you want more information about this podcast, you can go to historyofpersiapodcast.com. That's where you will find my bibliography, the Achaemenid family tree, and plenty of other things, including the support page, to financially support this project. There are all sorts of ways to do that, but most importantly, there's patreon.com/historyofpersia. You can sign up for a monthly subscription ranging from $1 to $20, and access to things like ad-free listening, bonus episodes, and discounted merchandise. Even if you don't want to subscribe, you can also visit the show's store, either through historyofpersiapodcast.com or historyofpersia.launchcart.com. You can also support this show for free by leaving a rating or review on your podcast app of choice. I always love to see your feedback, but even better than that, tell your friends to listen to the History of Persia. Share it on social media at History of Persia Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads, and just History of Persia on Twitter, and everything else that's trying to be Twitter. Thank you all so much for listening to The History of Persia.
BetMGM has an unreal deal for sports fans in Iowa. Turn $5 into $150 instantly when you place your first wager at BetMGM. Simply download the BetMGM app and sign up using code Hawkeye150. Then, Place a $5 wager on any sport. You'll receive $150 in bonus bets, regardless of your wager's outcome. And if you think the fun stops there, the king of sportsbooks has plenty of surprises in store. Check out daily promotions, same-game parlays, live bets, and so much more. No matter your team or your sport, BetMGM is for you. Download the app in Iowa today and get $150 in bonus bets instantly from your first wager. Only at BetMGM. BetMGM and GameSense remind you to play responsibly. See BetMGM.com for terms. 21 plus only. Iowa only. New customer offer. Subject to eligibility requirements. Rewards are non-withdrawable bonus bets that expire in 7 days. Please gamble responsibly. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-BETS-OFF.
Cashback is not available on gas in New Jersey and Wisconsin.
Billy, your gas light's on. We need to stop and fill up.
No way, Jen. Gas around here is too expensive. We can make it a little further.
Billy, listen to your big sister. You don't need to drive all over searching for the lowest gas prices. Do what I do and use Upside.
Upside?
Do you live under a rock, Billy? Upside is the hottest cashback app out there. It's free to download, and you get real cash back for every gallon of gas you buy. I use it all the time, and I've already made around $200.
You can make that kind of cash back just for buying the gas you have to buy anyway?
Yes, I'm looking at the Upside app now, and there's a gas station at the next exit offering 25 cents per gallon cash back.
Okay, I'm stopping to download Upside and fill up my tank. Download the free Upside app now to earn cash back every time you buy gas. Use promo code SIMPLE to get an extra 25 cents per gallon on your first tank. You can cash out anytime right to your bank, to PayPal, or a gift card for Amazon and other brands. Just download the free Upside app and use promo code SIMPLE for a 25 cents per gallon bonus on your first tank. That's code SIMPLE for a 25 cents per gallon bonus.